Hello, everybody. It is me again. It's Carson from Alan's Camera. Today, I'm here to present a webinar all about HDR workflow and exactly what that means. I am certainly not the expert here, but I'm joined by our good friend, Josh Friedman, who is. Um, First off, I just want to say, as we have questions begin to pour in, we are going to be using the Q&A functionality through Zoom. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask me or Josh, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. I will be answering as many questions as I can during the presentation, and anything that I don't feel qualified to answer, we're going to ask Josh near the end of the presentation for as long as he has time to answer questions. Other than that, that's sort of the logistical stuff that I need to handle. Josh, are you ready to get started?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Let me go ahead and throw this to you. Everybody, this is Josh Friedman.
Thanks so much. First, I want to start by saying thank you to Alan's for having me. Alan's has been my go-to since I discovered them maybe 7 or 8 years ago. A special thank you both to Carson and to David for all their help with the logistics in this program. And I also want to thank everybody who's watching today. Photography has been a real important part of my life for really as long as I could remember, since I'm a little kid, so about half a century at this point. I always had a Kodak Instamatic in my hand as a little kid for school field trips or wherever our family went. And by high school, I had a darkroom in my parents' basement. I developed black and white prints with friends. And I had a series of SLRs, and by the time the digital age came, I was a bit skeptical. I didn't know what to make of it. But now, fast forward to now, I really love the creative control that I have with digital photography, and part of that is HDR. Now, I should say, before getting into too much about HDR, Cynthia, my wife, and I are empty nesters at this point. I should be a little careful as I say that, because almost 3 years ago to the day, I would have said the same thing. And then 2 weeks later, we had a full house again. But back, we now have 2 college graduates, but go back about 8 years as we were anticipating our boys going off to college. I had a particular concern. And some of you might be thinking, well, did it have to do with would your kids adjust to college? Would they make friends? What would their freshman roommate be like? The academic demands, all that stuff. My concern was really, would Cynthia and I be able to use the remote controls so that we could control the TV? So if we wanted to switch from Netflix back to regular TV to watch a basketball game or something like that, could we do it? And, you might think, well, that's a little silly, but I only say that because I am not a tech guy. Sure enough, we adapted and we learned to watch TV, even in the absence of our sons. If I, as not a tech guy at all, can learn to do HDR. If any of you might be a little intimidated, sometimes you hear about merging different exposures and things like that. It sounds a little intimidating. If I could do it, there's a really good chance most of you can learn it too, if you're interested and with a little patience and a little practice, like most things. So let me get started. And oh, hold on a second. Okay. I'm going to start by showing a few sets of photographs. It's going to be a little bit like when you go to the eye doctor and they go, this one or this one. So let me start with a few sets of photographs. So okay. You might recognize that as the New Hope Lambertville Bridge. It's on the campus of Princeton University. This is Washington Crossing Park and the Delaware River. It's an abandoned truck in Upper Bucks. So in each of the sets, the first photograph is what my camera tells me is correct, and it is not edited in any way. The second is my HDR, which I created by merging multiple exposures, and that includes the first one, the unedited one. So here are a few more sets just for a comparison. Okay, let me talk a little bit. What does dynamic range mean? Dynamic range refers to the range of tones between the darkest and brightest areas within a scene. So if you imagine that this is a scene, the rectangle here, all the way on the right is very bright. It's basically white. All the way to the left is just about complete black. So it's a very large gap between the darkest and brightest areas. So it has a large dynamic range. If you imagine the scene, in this case, is between those two vertical lines. You know, to the left is a little darker, to the right is a little lighter, but basically it's a pretty narrow dynamic range. Now let me show you two photos that I took on the same day, just about a little over a year ago. It's February last year. If you're like me, you love photographing snow. This year was a little bit of a bummer. But this is a shot I took last February, the section of the canal sort of up near Bowman's Hill, across the street from Bowman's Hill Wildflower Preserve. In this scene, everything's pretty evenly lit. There's not a lot of huge differences between the darkest and the lightest. I certainly understand that the trees are darker than the snow, but everything is pretty much in the same range. Okay, so this is taken same day, not far at all from there. This is the Van Zandt covered bridge. This is a scene with a very high dynamic range. The inside of the bridge was heavily shadowed, so it was very dark, and the outside was, was brighter. Let me talk a little bit in terms of comparing how our eyes take in high dynamic range scenes as compared to cameras, even newer cameras. What you see on the left is what I shoot with. It's a Canon 5D Mark IV, which I bought at Allen's, by the way. Our eyes are more capable than cameras in terms of handling scenes with a large dynamic range. We can see detail in shadows while simultaneously seeing highlights in the brighter parts of the scene. Let me jump back to that photograph of the Van Zandt covered bridge. So this is an exposure that's pretty much correct for the inside of the bridge. So you can see some detail in the wood and so forth. So when you have the correct one, the correct exposure for the inside, the outside is sort of blown out, or the highlights are blown out, it's overexposed. By contrast, when you have an exposure that's correct for the outside, the interior of the bridge is underexposed, so it appears almost black with no detail. This is an HDR photo that I created by merging 5 exposures. In my, from my point of view, this is much more indicative of what it actually looked like in the scene. And it's closer to the way my eyes processed it. I could see detail on the inside, as well as seeing highlights in the outside, the brighter area, all at the same time. And again, let me just go back. Correct for the outside, this is what the inside looks like. Correct for the inside, this is what the outside looks like. But with an HDR image, it's much closer to how our eyes see it. Here's just one more example of that. This is I think the one shot that I took with my older camera that's in this presentation. This is the Lower Trenton Bridge, what we most of us call the Trenton Makes Bridge. And when I have the correct exposure for the bridge itself, the sky and the reflection of the sky are pretty blown out, no detail at all. Now, when you have an exposure that's pretty good for the very brightest parts of the sky, the bridge itself appears almost black with no detail at all. Now, when you merge them, this is an HDR from 5 exposures. It's again much closer to how it looked. This is around sunset. I took this maybe 7 or 8 years ago. So what is HDR photography? HDR photography, to me, I see it as a tool which can help you to create images which show a more complete range of darks and lights. This is particularly true in high contrast scenes. So multiple exposures are blended together using special software. I should say there's different software that's out there. For, I don't know, 12 or 14 years, I've used Photomatix Pro. Um, I'm using the 6th version of that, Photomatix Pro 6 presently. I can't speak to the other software, but I found this to be a very useful software. So the photographer makes sure to include correct exposures at regular intervals, ranging from the darkest shadowed parts of a scene to the brightest parts. So when would you try HDR? I tend to use it for landscapes and architecture. And that's not to say that that I always shoot landscapes in HDR. That first shot of the Delaware Canal, for example, the dynamic range of the scene was pretty small, so a single exposure really worked well for that. So when do I not use HDR? Portraits, sports, and scenes with a lot of movement, such as people, trees, like if it's windy out, animals, things like that. Now you see that I put the asterisk next to movement. I certainly do shoot a lot of water, the canal, the river, the Delaware River, and so forth. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, how to handle that. So let me now jump to the different steps in creating an HDR photograph. I'll start with what I do in the field. Then I'll talk about merging exposures with special software, again, Photomatix Pro. And I'll talk a little bit about post-processing with Adobe Photoshop and OnOne software. I'm going to mostly focus on the first two. The post-processing is fairly similar to what you might do in a non-HDR image. So before I talk about what I do in the field, let me just talk about the different components of any individual exposure. What could lead the exposure to be either brighter or darker? And sometimes it's called the exposure triangle, just because it's 3 parts. One is the ISO, or the sensitivity of the sensor. The second is the aperture, or the size of the opening. And the third is the shutter speed. Okay. So those 3 things, ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, are again, sometimes called the exposure triangle. So the 3 components of an exposure, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, can be combined in different ways in order to achieve different creative goals. So for example, when I shoot landscapes, I want a low ISO. So now I consider that 100 to 800. If we were talking about this 6 or 8 years ago, I would never consider 800, because that would be prone to giving it too much noise. But with some of the more modern cameras, I could shoot an 800 and it works out well for landscapes. I also want, for landscapes, a narrow aperture, something around f16, and that allows me to have a nice depth of field, because for landscapes, you want things close and in the distance all to be in focus at the same time. So let me compare that for a second to what a sports photographer might use. And again, I'm just talking about exposure and the exposure triangle. So for them, they probably want a very high ISO, 1600, 3200, or even higher, and a wide open aperture, such as f1.4 or f2.8. That would allow them to freeze the action. So for example, if you want a baseball player in the middle of their swing or something like that, if you want, if you're, shooting photos of the Sixers and you want to get Joel Embiid as he's dunking, you're going to want to freeze the action. So you want a very fast exposure. So I think certainly for HDR, but photography in general, it's useful to know how those 3 parts interact. One book that I find useful, I read it in the original version maybe 14 years ago or something, is Brian Peterson's Understanding Exposure. I think now it's in the 4th or 5th version. He's refined it over the years. Anyway, now let me jump to what I do when I'm in the field. So this is the first step in creating an HDR, is what I'm doing in the field. Just to get the sense of the big picture, the goal is to take a series of exposures at regular intervals, which cover the full dynamic range. I tend to start with a correct exposure for the darkest part of the scene, and then I go all the way to the brightest part of the scene. I'm going to hold the ISO and the aperture. Again, the aperture is the size of the opening. I'm going to hold those constant, but I'm going to vary the shutter speed at regular intervals. Typically, that's one stop at a time. So each time I speed up my shutter speed by one stop, I cut in half the amount of light for that exposure. Let me give you an example here. This is a shot I took about a month ago of Lake Afton. It's about 12 or maybe 15 minutes before sunrise. I was very fortunate to catch an absolutely beautiful day. The sky had like pinks and purples, really, really pretty. But when I got to the scene, I wanted to get a series of exposures. And so this is the series of exposures that I got. And you could see for each of them, the ISO and the aperture are constant. So for each of them, and the ISO is 800 and the aperture is f16. Now, if you look at the image on the upper left, I started, the most shadowed part of the scene was the old library, that building to the right. I wanted to make sure I had an exposure that was correct for the old library. So that was my starting point. So again, ISO 800 f16 is the aperture. I started with a speed of 5 seconds. And as you could see, the library looks good. That's the light, the way it really looked. It's illuminated the way it really looked when I was there. But when I had the correct exposure for that, the sky and the reflection of the sky and the water were completely blown out. No detail, no color. So I kept reducing at one stop at a time. So again, I started at 5, I cut in half to 2.5, then I cut in half to 1.25 seconds, and so on. And you can see as it gets, each exposure gets faster, the picture gets darker. And the last of them, the one to the bottom right, that's pretty much the way the sky and the reflection looked at the time. But when I have the correct exposure for the sky, the old libraries, it appears almost completely black, no detail at all. It's completely underexposed. When I blend them, I get this. Okay, but the starting point in the field is this. So let me give you a few considerations while I'm in the field. First of all, and again, this is just my workflow, my way of doing it. There might be other ways that other people do, and if that works for you, that's great. But this is sort of the way I go about it. I shoot in manual mode, which gives me more creative control. I have the camera on a tripod almost all the time when I'm shooting landscapes or architecture shots. In addition to keeping the camera stable, the tripod makes sure that each of the bracketed exposures will line up perfectly when they're merged. So in other words, you're going to vary the darkness. It's going to get progressively darker, each individual exposure, but you want the scene to be framed exactly the same way. So once I frame it, I lock it in on the tripod. I usually use a polarizing filter, which increases contrast and helps make an image pop, but you got to be careful with that. You don't want to sort of overdo it. I also use an external shutter release to prevent any accidental shake of the camera. That's I don't know if you guys could see that. This just sort of plugs into the side of the camera, and then I click the shutter with this button. And what that does, it prevents any accidental shake of the camera. It's always frustrating if you get back and you had a beautiful scene, but it's a little out of focus because the camera's shut. So that helps with that. So let me walk through. I did these maybe a month or so ago with this with this presentation in mind. And this is Delaware River looking towards the New Hope Lambertville bridge. So I tend to frame my shot using the optical viewfinder. It's just kind of what I grew up with and what I'm used to. If you like to look at the back of the camera, I look at it as whatever works for you. That's great. My preference is to frame it this way. And once I have the scene composed the way I like it, then I just, with a tripod, I sort of lock it in place. Then I switch over to live view. Live view allows me to see the image and settings on the LCD on the back. I could see in real time how changes in my settings impact on the exposure. They'll get darker or lighter depending upon if I'm speeding up or slowing down the exposure, the shutter speed. You can also focus in live view by touching the LCD if you set your camera up that way, which is also kind of neat. So I'm going to have the ISO and the aperture remaining constant. And the main things I'm focusing on in the live view are the different things at the bottom: the shutter speed, the aperture, the exposure level, and the ISO. When the exposure level, that thing sort of in the middle, is at 0, that's the value that the camera's algorithm is telling you. This is what we think is correct for the scene. Okay. I'm also looking at how does it look to me when I take an exposure. Does it look too dark, too light? Have I gotten a correct exposure for each of the different parts of the scene? And I look at the back to see that. So while I'm in live view, I manually bracket the series of exposures. I don't use automatic bracketing. To me, each situation is different and unique, and it calls for a different set of exposures. So sometimes I start like 3 or 4 f-stops to the right of what the camera is telling me, and I might only go down from there. So if someone else uses auto bracketing and that works, that's great. But for me, I prefer to do it manually. I also make sure that what's called a highlight alert, I make sure that that is enabled. And you could do that with your settings on most of the modern cameras. After you snap an exposure, if you have the highlight alert enabled, you can look on your LCD and anything that's overexposed is going to flash. And to me, that's kind of a neat feature. So if I'm starting with the part of the scene that's darkest, and that's correct, very often something like the sky is going to be flashing because it's overexposed. If you think back to that shot I showed a minute or two ago of Lake Afton, the sky would have been flashing on the back of my screen. So I first take an exposure that's correct for the darkest and most shadowed part of the scene. Then I take a series of exposures, speeding up the shutter speed at regular intervals, usually 1 stop at a time. Again, the ISO and aperture are held constant. So here are some exposures in live view that I took, again, about a month ago. The first in the upper left is the exposure that was right for the bridge, and the bridge was shadowed and facing me. The rising sun was going to be behind it. So the sky was much brighter than the bridge itself. If you look at the fourth one, that's more indicative of what the sky looked like at the time. But as you can see, the bridge in that one is underexposed. So it appears almost black with no detail. And jumping back to the first one for a second, if my highlight alert was enabled in my first one, the sky and part of the reflection of the sky in the water would have been flashing, telling me, okay, you're losing your highlights in this section of the image. All right. So the second step, once you're in the field, you've taken your different exposures, your bracketed exposures, you get home, I start by moving my bracketed exposures into Photomatix Pro. And I'm going to now show you a series of slides that show the sequence of screens as you merge the bracketed exposures into an HDR image using Photomatix Pro. And again, this is the software I've used. My sense is that other software is pretty, the workflow is pretty similar. And I've had good results for Photomatix Pro. So let me get started. First, this is in, I should mention also, I edit my images. I work with a MacBook Pro. My sense is that the workflow is going to be pretty similar on other types of computers. But so in my photo app, I start by highlighting the exposures that I want to merge, the bracketed exposures. So I move them into Photomatix. And by the way, there's usually a little bit of lag once I do that. And in a few minutes, I'll actually edit from beginning to end a photo, and you'll see that at different points it lags a little bit. But anyway, you just have to sort of bear with that. So when this screen pops up, it's going to ask you, what would you like to do with the dragged files? It automatically clicks merge for HDR rendering. I just click the green box that says OK. Then the next screen is going to show you your bracketed exposures as little thumbnails. And there's going to be little checks next to them on the left-hand side. When it's in this screen, you want to make sure that these are the correct exposures that you're intending to merge. You want to make sure you didn't accidentally include two that were set for the same exposure. In other words, the same shutter speed. So once you've checked it and you basically leave all the boxes checked, then you're going to go down where it says next, choose merge options, that green box, you click that. And this screen, usually I don't touch anything that's along the left side, align sources and all that stuff. I leave that as it is. In the towards the upper right, you see preset on tripod. I would say 95% or more of the time when I'm doing landscapes and architecture and so forth, I'm shooting on a tripod. So for most of the time, I just leave that in the on tripod mode. But if you click it, it'll give you a little menu that looks like this. If for some reason I was shooting handheld, then I would click that box to adjust that. So once you've done this, you go down to the green box, click it, and then the next screen has to do with de-ghosting. I'm going to pause. I'm going to come back to this screen in just a moment, but I'm going to pause just to talk about what ghosting is. So what is ghosting? Ghosting happens when something in the scene is moving, so it appears in a different place in different exposures. When the exposures get merged into an HDR image, you can see either blurriness sometimes, or sometimes it appears almost like a ghost, like part of the scene that's moving will be transparent. Let me give you an example. Now, this is something, a scene I shot about 10 or 12 years ago in Ocean City, New Jersey. If you look for a second at the guy in the red shirt, so this is 3 exposures. Now, typically, I would never do an HDR in this kind of scene because there's just so much movement. And one way to control movement is just while you're shooting, make sure, to the extent that it's possible, that things are not moving. So this is not a great candidate for an HDR image just because there's so much going on, so much movement. But if you focus your attention on the guy in the red shirt, in the first one, he's right at the end of the boat. The second one, he takes a little step to the left. Third one, he takes another step or two to the left. And there's also people moving in the back, kind of near the lifeguard stand. So when you blend these into an HDR image, this is the result. Now, I have the complete HDR image on the right, and then on the left, I zoomed in just to sort of emphasize what ghosting means. Now, you could see sort of the guy in the red, sort of three transparent images where he almost looks like our imagination would tell us a ghost looks like. And the people in the background by the lifeguard stand seem kind of disembodied or transparent also, you know. So if you have ghosting, so to prevent ghosting, who are you going to call? Well, you don't really call anybody, but Photomatix helps us with this. So that brings us back to this screen, which is where I paused just a moment or two ago. If you're sensing there's movement in the scene, and that could be anything, could be on the river's moving. It could be in this scene, maybe there was a little breeze shaking the trees. If I think there's movement that might affect or lead to blurriness or ghosting, I put my de-ghosting thing all the way to the right and say very strong. Additionally, you want to focus on what's called the base photo. And when I walk through an example in a few minutes, I'll give you a little better sense of that. But if I'm sensing there's movement, I'm going to click whatever is my fastest base photo. So in this case, it's 1/25 of a second, not super fast, but it's faster than all the others in the set. And that will sort of freeze things as much as possible. And then you get to this screen, which is sort of the starting point of the fine tuning of how you're going to merge the different bracketed exposures. And there are a lot of different starting points. They call them different styles. And there's a whole menu of them. I would say 95% of the time, use one of the top two, either what's called detailed or balanced. Those are the ones I use the most. And sometimes the few that follow, realistic, photographic, and natural, sometimes. Ironically, my experience is realistic doesn't look as realistic. And some of the other ones have almost like a surreal look. So that's not what I'm typically shooting for. So I don't use those as much. So I stick with those two at the top most of the time, detailed and balanced. So, let me hold off on that. I'm going to pause, and now I'm going to walk through editing of an image sort of from beginning to end. So these are, I'm going to go through, let me show you this. These are exposures. Oh, is it not advancing? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little pinwheel. These are 4 exposures that I took in Upper Bucks County. I took this from the Lumberville Raven Rock Bridge. On the left is the Delaware River. On the right is the Black Bass Hotel. The towpath is cutting through that. And just to the right of the towpath is the canal, which I took this in late December, a couple of days before New Year's, this past New Year's. So the canal was pretty dry, but you could sort of see my 4 bracketed photos. The first one, you could see the sky is completely blown out. And I took it as the sun was just peeking over the distant trees and distant hills. And you could see as I go to the 4th one, now I'm getting some detail in the sky and the river, but the canal and the towpath are almost completely black. And there's only a little detail in the Black Bass Hotel. So let me show you these again. Let me show you how I would go about editing these. I highlight the 4 that I'm going to edit. You could either drag them in, or I go edit with, and I'm going to choose Photomatix Pro and open. And it always is going to take like a half a minute or 45 seconds or so till I see anything. But that's normal. I always imagine there's like little elves or something in there that are working away at it. There we go. The elves were pretty quick this time. So this is the first screen. What would you like to do with the dragged files? And again, it is automatically going to say merge for HDR rendering, and I click OK. This is just about updates. That's nothing. Just click OK. And again, now here are my little thumbnails, and they go, this is the first one I shot over here. And that's again, the one that was set for correct exposure for the hotel. And this is the last one is a good exposure for the sky, but the hotel and the towpath and so forth are all overexposed. I'm sorry, underexposed. And you can see they get progressively faster. The f-stop and the ISO are constant for all of them, but they get progressively faster from 1/10th, 1/20th, 1/40th, 1/80th. So each one lets in half as much light as the prior. These are the 4 that I want. They're all checked. So then I click the green box. Then again, it was taken on a tripod. I leave these alone. I click the green box. And again, the L's are sort of doing their thing, this sort of magic that I don't really understand. The computer, probably my sons could explain it, what's actually happening back there, but I just let the software do its thing. It takes a few seconds. Oh, there we go. All right. So this is the deghosting page that I had mentioned. Let me drag it down a bit. And in this scene, there's a fair amount of movement. The clouds are moving kind of slowly. The river was obviously moving, and some of the smoke's moving. So I'm going to put the deghosting all the way up to 100. And unfortunately, the river looks, when the base is down, my base photo is down here, the river looks a little muddy. But when I do my fastest exposure, so in this series, it was 1/80th of a second, the river gets a lot more sharp. So once those are done, I've adjusted the deghosting and I've used the fastest as my base. I come over and click the OK. Again, just takes a few seconds for it to do its magic. Okay, so let me drag this down a little bit. So this is the sort of initial, by the way, I should say that with some of the software, whatever you've done last is what it sends you to when you do a new exposure, a new photo. So the 2 that I most often use are, again, detailed and balanced. So I can just eyeball them. For this one, I think I'm going to start with balanced. And so even without doing much, if you compare this, let me just jump back for a second to the first of the series, how the sky is completely overexposed, and the last of the series, when the hotel and the canal and so forth are completely underexposed. Let me jump over here. Without even doing any of the fine tuning, to me, it's already moving in the right direction. It looks much more like it was when I was there. Now I'm going to adjust the strength, pull that up to somewhere 78, 80, tone compression too. I should say, I look at these things a little bit like if you're doing a recipe and it says salt to taste or add black pepper to taste. I look at these that I don't have any specific formula. It's really what looks right to me in the image. So I adjust them according to what looks right to me. So That's to me is a pretty good starting point. I don't typically adjust luminance. Might look at the white clip. Right now it's about 4. Go a little to the left. Nah, I don't think so. A little, okay, I think I'm gonna leave it right around there. So I've done a little bit of fine tuning, not a ton of adjustments, but I've moved the strength a bit to the right and the tone compression to the right a bit. And again, very individualized according to the specific photo. Then I come down here and these things I don't touch at all. I'm gonna now move this from here. When I click finish, it's gonna begin merging those 4 photos. And from there, I'm gonna send it to Photoshop. And again, each individual stage just takes a few seconds for the camera to do its thing. The last thing is this little box that says finishing touches. And I don't typically do a lot in here. One thing I sometimes do, if for some reason it feels like it's not straight, I will make a little adjustment. And this, I think, part of the not looking straight is sort of an artifact of using a wide angle, but you can see straighten out the hotel just a little bit. I'm gonna say done. And then I'm gonna, when I do a save as, it's gonna send it to Photoshop. HDR demo. Okay, March 1st. To March 1. And then I'll save it. And when I save it, it's going to send it to Photoshop. Okay. Now that we're here, let me just close out Photomatix. And okay. Once I'm in Photoshop, and again, if you look where this is compared to the initial image, this or this, to me, we're already well on our way. I can see some detail in the sky, the hotel and the canal and the towpath are all visible. The river looks pretty good, but the initial HDR sometimes looks a little flat. So I'm gonna go and image adjust curves. And I usually make a little bit of an S. It starts as a straight line. I go down a little here, up and to the left, and I click OK. And compared to how it was, that just adds a little bit of pop. Then I look to see, is there anything that's sort of bothering me about the image? And one thing that is a little distracting, if you zoom in here, this little artifact, sometimes you shoot into the sun and there's some weird stuff like this, little artifacts. So I'm going to go into spot healing brush and I could adjust the brush size. That looks about right. If I go over here like this, and all right, to me that looks better than that versus that. And these areas, there's a little, zoom out for a second. Over here, it's a little, again, shooting into the sun. Sometimes you get this kind of thing. I'm just going to go here and do a little burning. And those of you familiar with Ansel Adams, these terms are from his time, dodging and burning. Dodging is sort of brightening up an area, burning, you're darkening an area. So I'm going to burn a little bit here so that these things are not distracting to me, okay? Just a little bit, not a lot. So now they're bothering me, now they're not bothering me. I'm not going to do fine-tune editing with this, but just these are some of the concerns that I would look at. Okay, so that's looking okay. Again, I might do a little more fine tuning if I was gonna spend a long time with this, but I want to give you sort of the gist of what I'm doing. Next, I'm going to go into OnOne effects. I've used OnOne for a while now, 7 or 8 years, and I find it helpful in some of my post processing. And this also, whenever I go into OnOne, whatever was my last filter that I used, it will use again. So I have to always start by doing reset all. And sometimes I go to HDR look, and I should, before I do that, let me say, on the right side are just individual filters that you can use. Each one of these is sort of a menu of that type of filter. On the left side, these are sort of blended filters. These are sort of individual, and these are preset blended filters. So one I sometimes do is HDR glow. And it adds a little pop. It might be a little too much, and I want to reduce the compression a little bit. You'll see what that does. Tones it down a little bit. It makes it pop just a little bit, which I like. So I'm going to leave that like that, and I'm going to apply it. Let me just show you one other thing. If you want to work on it in OnOne, if one of the neat things, you could work on a specific part of a photo if you want to. So let's say I want to bring out just a little more detail, or make the hotel, oops, again, you have to undo whatever it did. You could use an adjustment brush and apply whatever effect to a specific area. If I want to bring out a little more detail in the hotel, I might do an HDR brush. Let me bring this down so you can see. I'm going to increase the size a little bit. 500. I'm going to feather about 80, opacity about 60. Let me just show you as you go, as I bring this over, it'll bring out just a little bit of detail in the hotel. Again, that's the Black Bass Hotel in Lumberville. And show this. Down here's a preview button, and you could compare, do I like it with that effect or without? So you can see how what I did right then just affects that section. And you could adjust the opacity of the effect, sort of how much of it. So this is 0, 100, or 100 is all the way. I'm gonna do about 80, I think. And then I'm gonna preview again. Yeah, I kind of like that. So I'm gonna apply that. Again, it's gonna do it. It's sort of doing one thing at a time. And one other thing I sometimes do in OnOne, I'm going to go back to OnOne, is depending upon the image, if you want to sort of help sort of guide the viewer into it, sometimes I'll create a vignette around it. And again, each image is, and again, I reset that. Go back to my menu. Down here are vignettes. Each photo is so individual, but sometimes I find it helpful to add a vignette. So the one I use here is called Center Spot. And you could really fine tune them with, over on the right side, there is a bunch of sliders to fine tune. That's a little too much for me, so I'm gonna make the size bigger. I'm also gonna make it a little less rounded. If I go all the way down, it makes it like a rectangle. So I wanna have it somewhere between 40 and 50 is fine, I think. Let's see, what does that look like? Without and with. Make the size a little bigger still. And the feather, if there's no feather, it's like that. It means how gradually the transition is. I think something kind of like that. I kind of like that. It's not too over the top, so I'll apply that. And then that's going to send it back. All right, so this is where we are right now. If I wanted to, I could even go in, to the overexposed, right around the sun. Doesn't bother me too much, but if I wanted to, I could use clone. I'm just showing you as a sort of an illustration. I could go in here and clone the sky a little bit, move it over, clone a little bit on this side also, move that over. And I fine tune this a little bit, but you can sort of see that that area is getting reduced in terms of the sort of blown out area in the sky. But anyway, you kind of get the idea. But if you look at the overall image again, and then you compare to the initial ones, this is the first one that shows the hotel, right? And then you compare to this. To me, this is it's a nicer photograph, and it's more indicative of what it looked like to me when I was there. And then if you compare to the one that was better for the sky, again, this to me sort of works quite a bit better. So anyway, let me jump back to here, and I'm gonna come out of the presentation now and answer any questions. But if you have want to see more of my photos, or if you want to reach out to me, here's how you can do that. And I'll put this up again at the end. So let me. Okay.
All right. First of all, Josh, fantastic. Just
well,
because
thank you.
this is something I'm certainly, oh, excuse me, certainly not super familiar with myself. So I was kind of sitting here and taking my own notes as much as I was sort of
Okay, cool.
navigating the question and answers. So I had a lot of fun with it. But let me go ahead. We do have a couple of questions that had just rolled in, and there was one that was from a little while ago. I think it's definitely pertinent for what we're talking about here. And Amy was just asking, do you shoot RAW or JPEG, and why?
It's funny, when I'm shooting landscapes, I shoot RAW. And this just sort of gives you more information. The image is not compressed. You can get more detail, and I think overall a higher quality image that way. If I'm shooting, occasionally I'll take my camera to a game or something like that, and I'm doing sports, or a family event or something like that, and I know logistically it's just easier for me to send JPEGs out, and they take up a little less space. There's just sort of practical reasons I would do that for those reasons. Family events. I go to once in a blue moon, I'll bring my camera to a Sixers game or something like that, and in those I typically shoot JPEG. But for all my landscapes and so forth, I do shoot in RAW.
And even just to chime in with, my perspective on it, I am almost always shooting RAW, but for the exact reasons that you had just mentioned, if I want something that's a little bit smaller, if I know I'm not going to be doing any sort of editing with it, the
Right.
RAW file gives you much more latitude, which is why I'm sure for, the HDR functionalities, that's really kind of ideal. But yes, if you don't feel like you're going to be editing that photo a ton, especially if you want to be able to send it out quickly, I think JPEG is a fantastic option. All right, next up, Joe was wondering if you would like a black and white HDR, should you shoot in black and white or convert to black and white in post-processing? And he was also asking, should that conversion happen before or after you assemble the images into a single HDR image?
Good question. I always shoot in color. It's funny. I don't know if people do that, but it's a very good question. I always shoot in color and convert it afterwards. So I would, in the field, shoot color, convert it to HDR. Usually it's somewhere in that process of shooting in HDR, converting to HDR. I thought, this might look cool in black and white. And at that point, I convert it to black and white. And often I use the OnOne effects to do that. I know there's other ways that people convert to black and white that may be really good too. That's just become habit for me. And you can get really cool HDR black and white images. That's a good question. But to answer, excuse me, to answer the question of, I shoot in color all the time now. Convert while it's still in color, and then I would convert afterwards to black and white. If you wait, no, can I show you something here? I don't know if I could. Should I screen share
Yeah,
again?
absolutely.
Let's see if I
This,
could find it without taking up a ton of time. Okay, here we go. Uh, Give me 1 second. Let's see if I could find some HDR black and white. Uh, Hold on one. There's one I took on the Princeton campus that I think is a pretty good example. But of course, it'll take me forever when I'm trying to find it. Well, these are sort of, here we go. This one I thought was kind of cool. And this is HDR, like, I forget, Holder Hall or something like that. It's really cool. It feels like you're in a Harry Potter movie, there. But this is inside. It's sort of open air technically, because these windows don't have glass on them, but it's completely shadowed in here, and the outside is in sunlight. And I happened to be there early morning, and you get the sunburst in sort of the upper left. But to me, you could get some pretty cool black and white HDR for sure. So
that was, not to gush, but that was a phenomenal image. Just to
oh well,
say
thank you,
that one was
thank you.
and not to say that any of them were bad, but that one, for me, there's something about that I just thought was really cool. And it might have
Well,
even been the additional, I felt like that one had a tremendous number of sun streaks that was coming through, and it might have been the sort
yeah,
of general effect that was
yeah.
giving.
And sometimes that's always tricky, because you want the sun like partially blocked, you line it up, and the sun moved.
Right. Right. And then you're kind of slightly moving your tripod over, making these small adjustments. Yeah.
It probably looks crazy to someone watching. Like, why is he moving like a quarter of an inch? All right.
Let me keep going here so I don't end up taking up all your time. Paul Quinn is asking, do you ever use Lightroom instead of Photoshop?
Great question. And it's one of those things I keep kicking down the road. And it's funny. I don't have any good reason why I don't. And it's something I really need to get better at. I don't really know Lightroom. It's like, why do you keep bringing in from this restaurant? I'm used to it. It's pretty good. I'm not saying there's not better ones out there, but it's where I order from. But that's a really good question. And for several years, it's been this is the year I'm going to really try and get good at Lightroom. But,
I would
maybe
also
it'll be
say
2023. Who knows?
I think it's a little bit of a comfort level as well, just being able to navigate your way through a software. But regardless, there's a million and one ways to skin a cat when it comes down to it. So regardless of the software that you use, almost any of these photo editing softwares, when it comes to those adjustments that we were making, should be available. It might not be in the same places. You might not click on the same buttons, but you should have that same functionality in whatever editor you end up using.
And it's funny because Photoshop is a powerful, I think Lightroom is too, from what I understand. They're powerful, and I am sure I'm using like a tiny fraction. But what I do use, I use a lot, So
if it makes you feel any better, I don't know any shooter that uses even 50% of the capabilities of most of these softwares. So if you did somehow, I'd be pretty darn impressed. But moving along here, I had I believe this is Lisa Beth. I'm not 100% certain because they're together. I don't know if that's how it's pronounced, but they were asking, do you have any thoughts on cell phone photography and HDR within applications? They had particularly found that within an application called Snapseed, there was an HDR setting that they really enjoyed the performance of. So have you ever played with anything like that?
It's funny. I actually have a brand new cell phone, which I really haven't begun to really understand and use in terms of, other than just a few basic shots, I was here, kind of thing in the last month or so that I've been using it. In my old camera, I did the HDR a bit, and it's funny because I don't know exactly how it does it, how these programs work. At times I found them to be useful in terms of bringing out detail that in a non-HDR with the cell phone, I wasn't really seeing. I'm really not sure. I've seen some really cool stuff that people have done with cell phones recently that's really impressive. And in the last several years, I think the technology's really advanced a lot. But I don't know. It's funny. I tend to do everything manually, from the bracketing all the way through, which I know a lot of people do the auto bracketing, and maybe they get really good results. But this is just sort of my workflow, so.
Yeah, and also same thing, a million and one ways to skin a cat, whether
Yeah,
it's auto
absolutely.
bracketing, manual bracketing, I
Right,
mean, really, it's kind of like six this way, half dozen the other. So,
right.
next up, Sarah was wondering, what f-stop do you use to get sunburst? Now, actually, is that something that's reactive to the aperture specifically?
I use f16, which I believe so. Yeah, I think usually I get best results right around f16, f18, something like that, to get the sunburst. Yeah, and the sun is typically partially hidden, and that's why we were talking a minute ago, like in terms of moving a little bit, lining up the shot, and you don't quite get it, move it a tiny bit so it's just sort of blocked the right amount that the sun's peeking around something. But and I'm doing landscapes anyway, and so f16 is around what I'm using anyway.
Gotcha.
If everything is more or less the same distance from me in a scene, I'll be around f8, f11, but landscapes f16, f22, something like that. For me, that's my, what I'm comfortable, because I like something that's close to be in focus, and this, if there's mountains or whatever all the way in, I want that also to be in focus. I want a really wide depth of field. But for the sunburst, yeah, right around f16. And there's, other than the polarizer's like 99% of the time it's on.
Right.
If it's not, and I'm doing landscapes, it's usually that I like just did sports and I forgot to put it back. So it's not on purpose. But usually that's on also. But there's no special filter or anything like that for the sunburst. Just f16 and play with geometry a little bit, basically.
And take a look on your LCD, if you have those
Absolutely.
functionalities, which actually kind of leads into the next question pretty well. Dave was wondering, do mirrorless cameras automate this HDR process for us?
I think so. And to be fair, my 5D Mark IV, which is a digital SLR, it also does. I've had this about 5 years. I think like the first month I might have tried it once. And I'm not saying it doesn't work well. I just haven't gotten the habit of using it. And my guess is the answer for mirrorless. I've never shot with mirrorless, so I'm not an expert. But I would tend to think it's probably comparable. That these, but again, my sense is in a lot of scenes, when the exposure value is 0, it's saying, the camera is saying, according to my algorithm, this is what I think you should be using. And the whole purpose of HDR is that it's a much broader dynamic range. A lot of times I'm shooting to the right side of that, meaning what the camera is going to say is overexposed, and all of my, the last of my series might be what the camera is saying is right. You know what I'm saying? So a lot overexposed, a little bit less overexposed, but those are what we're, but if you're doing automatic, it's very likely that it's going to be go, let's say 1 or 2 f-stops above the 0 exposure value, and 1 above, then 0, then -1, and which to me, the whole thing should shift towards the brighter side in that image, and sometimes to the darker side. It sounds like Star Wars, but you know what I mean. So
Right. All right, next up, Deborah is asking, do you have a video on Photoshop? And she also asked, could you make one for us? I don't know. Do you have any other sort of material or anything that's out list on your socials
it's
or anything?
funny. I've done presentations here or there, including an HDR one, but I really revamped it for this. But I really don't. Another thing that's always in the God. I really ought to do that. So good question, and maybe that'll be the kick in the rear end that I need. Very good question, yeah, I would love to do that.
And I would also say, Deborah, we have a fantastic lab manager at the shop named Taylor. She's the person that does all of our photo restoration, our film development, and most of our printing services. So if you have any questions about Photoshop, I know she's relatively familiar. I'm sure between both her and Josh, we can certainly try and help you answer your questions.
Sure,
So feel free to reach out
absolutely.
to Josh and definitely reach out to us at the shop. All right, next up. Paul Quinn is asking, do you think MacBook is better for photos than PC? I don't know if you have much experience editing on PC or if you've
You know
noticed any
what?
sort of difference.
I I really don't. So I'm not a good person in terms of the comparison. I know that some of the local photographers who I'm friends with do use. I think they're still using PCs. So I don't know. Very good question. And again, I don't know that what I have is better or worse, but it's, as you alluded to earlier, it's kind of what I'm used to and I'm comfortable with it. But before I got this Mac, I said to myself, Josh, try something different. I got another. I had it for about 3 days, returned it, went and got a Mac. It's like, I'm just more comfortable with it. I can't say it. I don't know that I have a good reason, but I'm comfortable with it. So good question, but I'm not, I can't answer it though.
I would also say a lot of these programs are for both Windows and Mac.
Yeah.
So if you have a computer or something you're comfortable with, feel free to go in that direction. And if you want to try something different, if you're Windows going to Mac, Mac going to Windows, don't be afraid to experiment. I'm a Windows user, but at least going through film and video school, everybody else was Mac. So
Yeah.
you kind of can learn both systems, and there's nothing
Yeah.
wrong with either. They're both pretty
Yeah.
great. All right. Next up, Anonymous. Ooh, Anonymous was asking, tell us how you use the ND filter. If I'm not mistaken, you were saying that you're using a polarizing filter, not an ND filter typically, correct?
Right. It's funny. I do sometimes. I sometimes, if there's a clean horizon in an image, like you're at the beach, that's as clean as it gets, really. There, like a three-stop, graduated ND filter could be really useful. But a lot of the time, if you think, like when I showed the 5 bracketed exposures and then of Lake Afton on that sort of pink and purple sky morning, there isn't always like a line like this with the horizon. Or even like that picture I took on that I showed on the not the one I showed a minute ago, but even before. Although this one true too. The brighter there's not always a delineating line where above this is really bright and below this is dark. Sometimes it's a window that's in the middle. So for me, the ND doesn't really provide the function for that. But if you are at a beach or something like that, or certain landscapes, you really do have the sky is much brighter. It's not at all uncommon that I'll use one, and sometimes I do a series of bracketed with an ND, and then I still do an HDR. It's sort of combining, in my eyes, the best of both worlds, sort of. And you could end up using fewer if you do use the ND. Fewer, I don't know if that makes sense. Fewer total exposures.
Right.
But if I'm shooting through like inside the covered bridge, think of that exposure. The bright is sort of in the middle and what surrounds it is darker. So there isn't that clear delineation, but sometimes it's really, really useful in ND. Absolutely.
That was awesome. All right, next up, I have Sarah. And actually, this is a pretty fantastic question. Do you think you could get the same results by editing an image in parts as long as you do it in RAW? And I think this is a great opportunity to kind of talk about the latitude you get from a single image, and why you've chosen to merge several images together?
That's a good question. I don't know that I have the answer, but it's a really good question. What I have sometimes done, another sort of kind of similar inside the covered bridge, looking out kind of image. I've done what's called a layer mask. I don't know if that, where you sort of, it's almost like having two pieces of paper, one on top of the other, but it's digitally. And then you erase the top one and it reveals the bottom one. So I've done that, and that could be pretty cool. And in a sense, you're sort of separately editing each from the original file, if that makes any sense. So I've certainly done that, but that's a good question, and I don't know the answer. I'm not sure if you're saying if there's from one single exposure or from different exposures.
They were asking, if I really heavily edited one exposure, could I achieve similar results to what you're getting from combining, 3, 5, or more?
I'm going to say first of all, it really depends on the scene. The scene that I kind of went through, where on the right side was a Black Bass hotel, and the left side's a river, and the sun's rising, the one that I kind of went through like that, the canal was so dark. I think, like in the last one, there's no detail to be had, and the sky, there was really, in the first of the series, there was really no detail. You can't bring out what's not there. You know what I mean? You have to have it there. So in some situations, maybe so. When it's really high contrast, I don't think so. But maybe someone who's really good at Lightroom could bring out a little more. But from my vantage point, we're talking several f-stops apart. That's really hard. I mean, I don't think there was detail to be had in those exposures.
And I would even say an easy way to test this would even be, taking the image that your camera says is properly exposed, taking your multiple exposures, whether that be above or below that line. So let's say you have 5 exposures, take your 5. You can make yourself an HDR image out of those 5, and then you could just as easily take your middle exposure, the one that the camera says is your normal exposure, heavily edit that, and try and make it as similar to the HDR image you created as possible. And that will kind of show you, at least with your camera and the way that it handles the information, how flexible your shadows and your highlights are going to be in different scenarios.
And as you were saying that, it sort of triggered for me. Once in a while, I have the experience of coming back. I have a bracketed series. I make it into an HDR, and I look at it and I'm like, it just isn't working. And then I go to one of the original and I sort of do a little fine tuning with that. I'm like, I like the original, just one exposure better. So that absolutely does happen, with some regularity, that you sort of come back and either it just seems muddy or doesn't seem right, or something about it looks artificial. But then, just a little bit of fine tuning on one of the original exposures is great, and I really like it. So, I'd rather stick with that in that situation. So good question.
So we have actually run out of question and answers from at least the attendees. I have one question for you, if you're willing to humor me.
Absolutely.
So, it's something I talk about a lot with people in the shop, talking about, the performance of cameras and what we can get out of them. And we've kind of seen through this workflow of, combining images, really how much we can stretch the capability of the camera. But it sounds like what you're going for and what you're looking to achieve with all of these different images is not necessarily every bit of information or putting everything exactly where you think it needs to be, but it seems like your workflow is much more about getting what you want and what you're looking for out of the image. I don't know if you could talk for a second just about kind of what you do to make sure that you're always happy with what you're making, because as much as I love going out and taking images, sometimes I bring them into my computer and they don't really excite me. So I guess I would say, what is exciting for you about the images that you take, and how do you continue to make yourself happy through the process of regular editing, through HDR editing, or what have you?
Good question. It's funny. I think I think there's a broad range of things that in terms of my photos. Not long ago, we were down in Philadelphia Museum of Art, and I was actually looking at a couple of Monets, different medium altogether, right? But if you look at a series of Monet, he's a lot of different series that he did, and kind of what makes me tick is probably kind of related to what made him tick. I'm not saying I'm Monet by any stretch, but like the way light plays off of the same thing in different ways, at sometimes different seasons, sometimes different lighting conditions. Sometimes, like, I'm a big fan of morning fog. My wife laughs at me because I'm saying, honey, it's really foggy, I'll see you in an hour, and it's like, okay, whatever. So I just love that. But it really varies so much by the individual scene. Occasionally I will go out thinking, I want to get this. More often it's, let me go see what I find that sparks me. And then usually there's something, whatever it is. Beyond that, I think it's so individualized by the image. Like it's funny, like those two scenes on the in the snow that it kind of started with, very different. One didn't need HDR. I think I might have shot for HDR. It was like, this is silly. This is like, everything's even. I don't need, I'll only muddy the water by doing an HDR image of this. The one looking out the bridge, to me, is like, it's not conveying any single exposure, not conveying what I'm seeing. I want it to look kind of, it's funny. Sometimes I think about this. If you think of sort of a journalistic attitude towards, and I don't mean that in any negative way. I mean, I tremendously respect photojournalists. I don't mean that in any negative way. Just, a single shot, this is unedited, blah, 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 blah. That's a different thing. And there's a lot of creativity in that. But I kind of want to be like believable. That someone's like, yeah, that could look like that, I may, in my head, well, I've kind of tinkered a little bit, but I want to make it so that someone could look at it and sort of, it'll look nice. It'll maybe tap into some emotion for them. Or, a lot of people say my photos are calming. It's probably somewhat of the subject matter and somewhat of maybe some of the editing and so forth. I like nature and outdoors and so forth. So, I think people, I'm an early riser. So I love getting, like, you give me a pink sky and I'm a happy guy. That's just good stuff. So I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, because I think each individual photo for me is different. And it's, it's like, some days I like Italian food. Some days I like Chinese food. Some days I like Thai food. I don't know. I love it all, but so I apologize if that's not sort of a great answer, but
no, I think, there will be people that will shoot the same thing for 50 years and always be excited about it and always find something. But I think that answer is just as valid. And I'm more asked because I know people, as we begin to shoot more and more and more, you get very comfortable with your workflow, but then you start asking yourself, like, what am I doing? Why do I take so many images? And I think at the end of the day, we all kind of come back to this idea of, well, I'm really trying to make something that I'm excited about and I'm happy with, and that I just like looking at.
Absolutely.
So it sounded like, even, hey, let me paint a little bit of this, let me do a little dodging and burning, so this looks how I want it to. It's not necessarily how it looked that day or how the camera captured it. It was, how do I make this image look the way that I want it to?
Right. And it's funny because sometimes it's like, sometimes like what I am looking at, sometimes I want to not be looking at. If there's like a branch or that sort of sticks out, that bothers me. I could have complete clutter in my room on you, but if a little thing like that, I'm like, I don't want the eye of the viewer to be going towards that. and I will crop that out, you know. In the initial series, when I said it was like going to an eye exam, it was like this one or this one. There were two of the like 10 minutes before sunrise over the Delaware River in Washington Crossing Historic Park, looking towards the bridge. The first one, the second one was my HDR image that was completed. The first one, I don't know if anyone noticed, and if anyone's obsessive like me, in the upper left-hand corner, there's a series of little branches. They're gone by the second one. They're cropped out. That thing will, it's little things like that, that where your eye is going, that I want the viewer's eye to kind of go where I want it to go. Which is funny because once in a while, like I sell my photos on Etsy, and not long ago, someone reached out to me. It's like, do you see in this old tree like a person running in the middle? And like, I did not see that, you know. The branches of this old tree look all right, great, cool. That looks like that way to you. Didn't look that way to me, but
Wonderful. And yeah, no, I think that was a fantastic answer. But Josh, we've reached the end of our webinar. Again, this was absolutely fantastic. I
well, thank you.
learned a lot. So if I have follow-up questions, I know where to find you. And of course, for all of our
Absolutely.
attendees, if you need anything, we have posted all of Josh's information in the chat, as well as I believe we have an Instagram post if you need to reference anything after the Zoom has actually ended. And of course, you can always call Alan's Camera, 215-547-2841, or go to alanscamera.com and you can find all of our information there. Josh, was there anything else that you wanted to say just before we wrap up here?
No, thank you so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun, you know, so let's do it again sometime.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
but thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And, you know, I've since I discovered Alan's, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, it has been my go-to, and I have referred many folks to you and say, you know what, don't go there, go there. These people are honest. They will talk you through. They know all about the equipment and blah, blah, blah. Go there. You know, to me, it is worth it to go and talk to people who know what they're talking about. So, you know, I like talking about HDR, and I like talking for people who I respect and appreciate. So thank you.
Well, we certainly appreciate you and everything that you've at least done for us tonight. Of course, if anybody else has questions, like I said, feel free to call me at the shop. You can reach me or any of my coworkers 9:30 to 5 Monday through Friday and 10 to 4 on Saturdays. But other than that, we're going to wrap up here. I'm going to go ahead and throw to our presentation. But Josh, again, it's been such a pleasure, and thank you so much for
Oh, thank
reaching
you
out.
so much. Appreciate it.
Right.